The policies usually explicitly exclude losses caused by terrorism.
What he just said there is flat out wrong. Personal auto policies do not generally exclude losses due to terrorism. Hey everyone, I want to do a different type of reaction video today to LegalEagle because recently, well, I don't know how to say it other than he was wrong. Like, very, very wrong. Now, personally, I really like LegalEagle's content. It's entertaining, it's engaging, it's educational. I even took his online course on fair use. Now, that course wasn't cheap, but I found it to be extremely valuable for anyone who wants to do some reaction style content and navigate the inevitable copyright claims that'll be coming your way. So, tremendous respect for what he does, but he really missed the boat on his recent Tesla videos. Now, to be clear, I'm not an attorney, nor do I sell property and casualty insurance. I'm just someone who's more interested in P&C insurance than I should be. But I'm not going to give you any empty claims. We're going to take a deep dive, look at some cases, and I'll present evidence for why LegalEagle's analysis doesn't apply to personal auto policies. And even more, it was right there the whole time in plain sight within his own video. All right, so without further ado, let's dive in.
Owning a Tesla just got a whole lot riskier, and not just because the Cybertruck recall proved they're held together with defective glue. First came the vandalism, then terrorism allegations, and next, insurance refuses to pay for damaged cars.
Now, real quick, one important thing to note right off the bat here is that I'm not aware of any documented cases of insurance companies refusing to pay for damaged Teslas. If this was happening, there would be big stories. Lately, media generally loves any good anti-Tesla story, so they would be all over this. But we just don't see it. That alone doesn't mean his analysis is wrong, of course, but we'll get to the issues with it later here.
Because President Trump announced that Tesla vandalism attacks were acts of domestic terror, and the Department of Justice followed its lead. Attorney General Pam Bondi said, quote, "Let this be a warning, if you join this wave of domestic terrorism against Tesla properties, the Department of Justice will put you behind bars." And the FBI started a domestic terrorism task force devoted to investigating attacks against Tesla.
Now, we'll get to this a bit later in this video, as there actually are some more important points I want to touch on first, but it's worth noting that even in cases where terrorism exclusions could apply, which are generally not personal auto policies, what the FBI and Department of Justice deem a terrorism event is actually not what controls classification for an insurance claim. There are some more formal requirements.
Now that's bad news for people that broke the law. They could face 5 to 15 years in prison. But that doesn't help Tesla owners who are the victims of vandalism, because now their insurance might not pay out at all. Now typically personal auto policies will cover damage to your car that's caused by fire or vandalism, with one big caveat. The policies usually explicitly exclude losses caused by terrorism.
What he just said there is flat out wrong. Personal auto policies do not generally exclude losses due to terrorism. And fortunately, you don't just have to take my word for it. Within the property and casualty insurance market, you have what is referred to as the Insurance Services Office, or ISO. Now, ISO is a private company that creates standardized insurance forms and guidelines used by many insurance companies across the US. ISO forms are designed to meet state insurance requirements across all 50 states. By adopting these forms, often with some minor state-specific tweaks, insurers reduce the risk of having their filings rejected by state departments of insurance. If an insurance company wants to go to market with a personal auto policy, they first have to file their policies for approval with the state's Department of Insurance. Now, the advantage of adopting an ISO policy is that you're basically good to go. From an insurance company's perspective, it's like having a pre-approved policy that you can adopt and start using in your business. Now, it's possible to deviate from an ISO contract, but this can get quite expensive and can involve lengthy legal scrutiny and review of a policy. Generally, only the largest insurance companies will do this, and even then, there are some major costs and legal uncertainties involved that can make insurance companies really question whether they want to go down that route. For instance, adding proprietary language to a form introduces legal interpretation risk that wouldn't be there when you can use an ISO policy that has legal precedents around the interpretation of provisions within it. So, what does the current ISO policy say about terrorism exclusions? Absolutely nothing. It's not in there. Unlike specialized commercial policies, standard personal auto insurance policies do not usually list terrorism as an excluded peril. Policies often contain exclusions for things like war, insurrection, and civil war, but those are narrowly defined and distinct from terrorism. But again, don't just take my word for it. Let's look directly at the ISO form. Let's focus our attention here on Section D, coverage for damage to your auto. Now, We'll note that we are, of course, talking about other than collision, right? This is another way of saying comprehensive coverage, as we're not talking about a car accident here. Notably, check out the list of things that are considered other than collision, such as missiles and falling objects, fire, explosion, malicious mischief and vandalism, riot or civil commotion, and breakage of glass. But what we really want to look at here is the section titled Exclusions, the section that starts on page 9 and extends into page 10. What's most important here is actually this subsection 3 under Exclusions, which excludes coverage for loss due to or as a consequence of radioactive contamination, discharge of any nuclear weapon, even if accidental, war, declared or undeclared, civil war, insurrection, and rebellion or revolution. So, if the Hulk takes your Model Y for a joyride and it gets some radioactive contamination, well, then you may not be covered. But terrorism is not excluded. There's no mention at all of terrorism here. It's just not there. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, Derek, what about insurrection or rebellion or revolution? Do those count? We'll look at some later examples here that illustrate why these are not concerns either. But for now, let's just note that terrorism is more specifically defined and is subject to different rules and exclusions. Someone Molotov cocktailing your Tesla is not one of them.
The Insurance Information Institute says that personal auto policies, quote, will cover a car that is damaged or destroyed in a terrorist attack only if the policyholder has purchased optional comprehensive coverage. But even if you have a comprehensive policy, whether you have coverage depends on specific policy language and whether you have exclusions for terrorism or war.
Now, what LegalEagle did here was actually quite confusing and a bit of a sleight of hand. So I want to break this down. Let's look again at his first sentence.
The Insurance Information Institute says that personal auto policies, quote, will cover a car that is damaged or destroyed in a terrorist attack only if the policyholder has purchased optional comprehensive coverage.
All the Insurance Information Institute is saying here is that you need comprehensive coverage to qualify for filing a claim other than a collision. This should be pretty obvious, right? If you don't pay for comprehensive coverage that covers things other than a collision, like a tree falling on your car, then you're not going to have coverage for things other than a collision, like a terrorist attack. Now, let's look at his next sentence carefully as well.
But even if you have a comprehensive policy, whether you have coverage depends on specific policy language and whether you have exclusions for terrorism or war.
Now, here's where LegalEagle is really conflating things. Yes, it's true that policies can have exclusions. We already looked at a list of exclusions in the standard ISO personal auto policy, and we saw that things like war and civil war were excluded, but terrorism was not. He sneaks this in here as if terrorism is just like war, as a standard exclusion in a personal auto policy, but it's not. Now, there's actually some interesting history around terrorism exclusions, particularly after 9/11. After 9/11, Congress passed the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act of 2002, or TRIA. Now, TRIA created a federal reinsurance backstop for terrorism losses and regulated how terrorism is handled in insurance policies. This was a big deal. In fact, TRIA nullified all pre-existing terrorism exclusions in property casualty policies and preempted any state approvals of such exclusions. In other words, if an insurer's policy in 2001 had said, "We don't cover terrorism," that clause was voided by TRIA. Now, TRIA also introduced a sort of bifurcation of rules between personal coverage and commercial or business coverage. On the personal side, you basically have to cover terrorism. However, on the commercial side, where buyers are assumed to be more sophisticated, policyholders can decline terrorism coverage. But even if a business declines, there are still some important caveats. Remember, TRIA nullified all terrorism exclusions, but if a business elected to waive this coverage, this exclusion still only applies to officially certified acts of terrorism, as determined by the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the Attorney General and Secretary of Homeland Security, which is obviously not just the President and who the Department of Justice chooses to seek charges against. But more importantly, to be certifiable, these events must meet certain loss thresholds. TRIA has been reauthorized through 2027 and defines a certifiable act as one causing at least $5 million in insured losses. So even if someone firebombs a brand new fleet of 70 long-range Cybertrucks with a current MSRP of $69,990, and even if that fleet owner declined terrorism coverage, those losses alone would not meet the $5 million threshold to certify an act of terrorism, and that business owner would still be covered despite waiving terrorism coverage if TRIA certification is the only terrorism classification in a policy. Now, of course, it is possible that a commercial policy contains a broader terrorism exclusion not tied to TRIA certification, but these are relatively rare and would require regulatory approval. In most standard commercial policies, if the act isn't certified under TRIA, then the terrorism exclusion simply doesn't apply, and you'd still be covered. But again, we're now talking about business coverage, which is very different than personal coverage. Departments of insurance were more open to the idea of allowing more sophisticated business owners to waive terrorism coverage, but they were very hostile to the idea of waiving that for personal coverage. For personal auto policies after TRIA, insurers generally did not introduce terrorism exclusions. Most state regulators even refuse to approve such exclusions for personal lines, deeming them to be against public policy. New York's Department of Insurance flatly stated in 2002 that it has not approved any terrorism exclusions in property or casualty policies and found them misleading or violating of public policy. Connecticut's Department of Insurance took a similar stance, disapproving terrorism exclusion endorsements for personal auto and homeowners policies as inconsistent with state law. So the upshot here is that while you should always read your policy and verify, it's extremely unlikely that someone has a personal auto policy that excludes terrorism. Don't be fooled by LegalEagle's sleight of hand here to conflate terrorism with war, which is almost always excluded from personal auto coverage. Now, I know I've gone on for a while here, but I want to go back to the quote LegalEagle shared for a second. What's absolutely amazing is if we scroll just a little further down, this is clearly stated on the Insurance Information Institute's website, right there in plain sight. I quote, "For the terrorism coverage to be triggered under TRIA for commercial policies, a terrorist attack has to be declared a certified act by the Secretary of the Treasury. Note that no such declaration is needed to trigger coverage under home and auto policies because there are no exclusions for terrorism."
And a lot of policies have explicit exclusions for terrorism. Now, the definition of terrorism varies by insurer, but the policies generally track the government's definition of domestic terror.
No, they don't. I'm repeating myself, but this is just not true if we're talking about personal coverage. It's possible for business coverage, but we still have all the requirements around what is a certifiable terrorist attack, as noted previously.
For example, here's the terrorism exclusion from the Hartford.
Oh, do you see what he did there? This is a business auto coverage form. Why is he showing us a business auto policy? Because, well, that can have language around terrorism. But his message in this video is that a normal person who owns a Tesla is at great risk because of the Trump administration potentially punishing vandalism as domestic terrorism. But that person is going to have a personal auto policy. As we looked at with the ISO personal auto policy earlier, and from feedback from regulators in states like New York and Connecticut, we're extremely unlikely to see any language like he's about to show us on a personal auto policy.
It defines terrorism as, quote, "the threat or use of force or violence when one or both of the following applies. The effect is to intimidate or coerce the government, or the intent is to further political, ideological, religious, social, or economic objectives, or to express opposition to a philosophy or ideology." Who decides whether the exclusion applies? An insurance adjuster. And, spoiler alert, when in doubt, insurers almost always side with themselves.
Okay, a few things I don't like here. First, we have the claim that the insurance adjuster is who decides if an event is an act of terrorism. Now, in a simplistic way, sure, this is true. The insurance adjuster will give you the insurance company's opinion on what applies, but that's not a final ruling. Insurance cases go to court all the time because insureds and insurance companies disagree over what should be covered. But the language of this sample policy is really a distraction. TRIA is still in effect via its extension through 2027, so we still have to contend with the rules and regulations of TRIA, including the requirements that you would need to at least have $5 million of damage for a certifiable terrorist event, and even then you still need verification of that from the Treasury in concurrence with the Attorney General and Homeland Security, along with the other requirements about the nature of an attack we haven't even covered here. So in this case, it is nowhere near as simple as just looking at the contract language. A judge may be apt to find that a small-scale act does not trigger the exclusion, and any ambiguity in the definition would be construed against the insurer per the doctrine of contra preferentum in insurance law. Now, I'm not aware of any legal cases that really look at trying to classify ordinary vandalism as terrorism, but we do have historical examples of insurers trying to classify acts of terrorism that were covered under a policy as instead acts of war to try and get out of paying those claims. Consider 9/11. In that case, some insurers argued that 9/11 was an act of war to try and avoid certain payouts. Now, courts flatly rejected that argument, stressing that war exclusions apply only to conflicts between sovereign entities, not terrorist attacks. Courts have simply overwhelmingly rejected attempts to stretch warlike exclusions to deny coverage for terrorist or insurgent acts. A landmark case is the Pan American World Airways versus Aetna, where insurers argued that hijacking and destruction of a plane by a militant group was a warlike act and thus excluded. The court disagreed, emphasizing that war requires hostilities between de facto governments, and an attack by a non-state group, even if politically motivated, did not qualify. The judges noted that if insurers wanted to exclude terrorist acts, they needed to say so explicitly, and that absent a clearly worded terrorism exclusion, the loss was covered. Similarly, in Holiday Inn Incorporated versus Aetna, heavy damage to a hotel during months of militia fighting in 1970s Beirut was not deemed an insurrection for insurance purposes because the militias weren't trying to overthrow the government. These cases illustrate that courts interpret war insurrection exclusions narrowly. By analogy, vandalism against Teslas by political activists, even if dramatic, would not meet the high bar for war or insurrection, which are the types of exclusions actually found in personal auto policies. Insurance companies simply can't relabel ordinary vandalism as a form of war or rebellion to escape liability.
But if the government describes an event as terrorism, that gives the insurers even more incentive to deny the claims. And the Hartford's policy reflects this, saying, quote, terrorism also includes any act that a government or applicable jurisdictional authority declares or certifies to be an act of terrorism.
Again, he's reading language from a business auto policy here, which we shouldn't be doing in the first place. And just as a reminder, we still have the TRIA requirements regardless of the language in a particular company's policy. That fleet of 70 long-range Cybertrucks we mentioned before could get completely torched, and we'd still be under the $5 million of losses for an event to be certified a terrorist act if a policy has a TRIA classification.
So if your Tesla gets torched, you better hope your insurer isn't reading the DOJ's press releases. If you own a Tesla, you need a good lawyer. But with my law firm, the Eagle Team, you'll get a great lawyer and pay nothing unless you win. So click on the link below.
I really wouldn't want an ad for a law firm following all of that, but this was just not good coverage. I like LegalEagle, but this was sloppy, not well researched, and just flat out misleading. To the point that if LegalEagle has some integrity, he should really be taking his video down and not continuing to mislead people. This will legitimately scare some people. His reach and his audience is large enough that there will probably be someone out there who's in a financial pinch. Probably someone who's upside down in a Tesla they bought not too long ago and probably not for any political reasons, and might unnecessarily take a hit of thousands of dollars because they're now scared of a lack of insurance coverage that LegalEagle completely fabricated. If you have a Tesla and you have a personal auto policy, go ahead and read your policy because that is always a best practice, but you almost certainly don't have anything to worry about. If you're like most Americans, what you probably should be worried about is those idiots around us driving around with state minimums. Don't do that. I personally would shoot for at least $250, $500, $250 coverage. That means $250,000 of bodily injury coverage for each person injured in an accident, $500,000 of total coverage for all people injured in a single accident, and $250,000 of coverage for property damage caused to others. And I would also make sure I have uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage as well. On top of that, I think it's generally very wise to consider adding an uninsured and underinsured motorist endorsement to an umbrella policy because that can really significantly increase coverage that would actually benefit you in the event you were seriously harmed by someone without insurance or with too little insurance. But go ahead and relax and ignore LegalEagle on this one. I want to reiterate that there are no public reports that I'm aware of that auto insurers have denied Tesla vandalism claims by invoking any sort of terrorism or war exclusion. Even amid the politically charged Tesla incidents, major insurers have not signaled any intent to classify these as uncovered terrorism losses. Indeed, insurers have strong incentives to honor these claims. Vandalism repairs, even a few $1,000s or a total loss of a car, are well within the scope of everyday auto insurance payouts. Attempting to deny coverage on a novel technicality would invite bad faith lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational damage, all far worse for an insurer than simply paying a legitimate comprehensive claim. But suppose, hypothetically, an insurer did attempt to deny a claim by saying, This act was domestic terrorism, excluded by the policy. Would that hold up? In all likelihood, no. Such a denial would be difficult to sustain under existing law. First, as we've discussed, the policy would need to actually contain a valid terrorism exclusion encompassing the event. Most simply don't. And even if it did, a court would examine whether an incident meets the policy's definition of terrorism, if any, and whether that definition is enforceable. Given regulators' insistence on high thresholds and narrow application, a judge is apt to find that the small-scale act does not trigger the exclusion. So I hope you found that helpful. Until next time, like, subscribe, or I'll see you in court. Wait, that's not my sign-off. Why? Why did I say that?